As I was looking through the manuscript of my book in advance of this, it just struck me that the scope and scale of this criminal activity is new. But the fact that Hizballah has been engaging in criminal activity is not new at all. I was going back through the book and looking at examples of Hizballah and Hizballah support activity in South America, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, going back to the 1980s, certainly the 1990s, and remembering some of my favorite examples, not only the travel agencies that played such critical roles providing false documentation for Hizballah supporters, criminals, and later operatives in the context of the 1992 bombing of the Israeli embassy and the 1994 bombing of the Amia Jewish Community Center in the tri-border area, but also cases like the arrest in November 1999 of a key operative in Southeast Asia, Pandu Yudo Winata, who actually wasn't intended to be arrested when he was arrested in a Filipino airport because intelligence services were following him at the time, but he happened to be carrying shabu, or ice, on his person, a classic drug, and the capture and exposure ended up disrupting a whole bunch of not only criminal activities, but also cached weapons and actual ongoing plots in the region targeting not only Israeli, but actually some Western and some American targets as well. By 1998, the CIA penned a classified report, since declassified, 18-page report on the Lebanese in sub-Saharan Africa, which, among other things, went to great detail about the criminal activities of Hizballah, and even more so at the time Amal, though most of that is now Hizballah in Africa. Just in the press just this week, we see that the Tajuddin family, several of the Tajuddin brothers, have been designated by the Treasury Department. The one main brother who has not, just received a major concession in the timber industry in the Congo. We'll see how that plays out. This is a family with very, very close ties to Hizballah, ties to Jihad al-Binna, Hizballah's designated construction company, through which it has been purchasing property in Lebanon to build continuity, geographical continuity between Shia strongholds, etc. One of the things you see as you go through this over the years is that there is within the Hizballah support network really a continuum. You have people who are sympathetic to Hizballah, you have people who are more actively supportive of Hizballah, and at the far end you have people who are trained militants with experience in the camps in Iran, in Lebanon, every once in a while, actual experience in militant activity themselves. And the one thing that is shared along this continuum is that their support for Hizballah, whether it's through illicit or otherwise licit activities, is there for Hizballah to draw upon. In other words, Hizballah can draw upon not only the criminal activities of its hardened, as if card-carrying members, but also its much larger pool of sympathizers, people who actively want to sympathize and provide funds to Hizballah, people who feel the need to buy protection or benefit for their families back home, and of course also those who are at the receiving end of mafia-style shakedowns of the kind that we've seen in South America, in Southeast Asia, and even the FBI reports here in the United States. But I think it's undeniable that there has not been a sharp rise in this activity, arguably, as David said, since 2003, but we've really only started noticing it in the past few years. A couple of cases in Philadelphia in 2009 that indicate the scope and the scale of this activity, from weapons procurement, including shoulder-fire missiles intended to bring down F-16s, to PlayStation 2 trafficking, stolen laptop computers. My favorite example from this massive case is when an individual affiliated with Hizballah approaches a cooperating witness who's posing as a criminal and says, I want to be able to fence some counterfeit $100 bills that Hizballah has at its disposal. And the CW says, fine, but I'll need to take a look at this counterfeit money. He provides the counterfeit money. The person is working with the U.S. government, so they provide it to the Secret Service. Secret Service looks at this and says, I've got good news and I've got bad news. The good news is it's not counterfeit. The bad news is it's not counterfeit. So the CW goes back to the Hizballah guy and says, well, you know, I did some checks. This is not counterfeit. And the guy blushes a little bit and says, well, you're right. We have counterfeit too if you want, but really we're also very eager to sell stolen monies. We have people all over the world stealing money, and we've had some great success stealing money in the Middle East. It's not explicit, but the presumption is Iraq. And they're looking to sell pennies on the dollar, actual $100 bills. Or the other case in Philadelphia with Danny Tariff, who was looking to procure sophisticated weapons for Hizballah. My favorite part of that case is where he tells the individuals he's working with that the weapons were to be exported to the port of Latakia in Syria, where he said Hizballah controlled the port, where secrecy is guaranteed, all the cameras get turned down at the port for the shipment. No paperwork would be required once the stuff reaches Syria. Some of it would be shipped to Syria, some to Iran. It's all good. This is stuff that's happening here in the United States. There are a whole host of other cases, some of them demonstrating the scope of the extent to which Hizballah is willing to go to raise money or develop relationships, including an instance where a Hizballah-associated arms trafficker agrees to sell weapons in return for dope with the Taliban. Only those were undercover DEA guys as well. And then, of course, you have the massive interlocking cases of Ayman Juma and Lebanese Canadian Bank. Most people don't pay attention, but several of you in the room I see here know it because you were involved in it. But Ayman Juma was designated as a narco-trafficker first. No mention was made of Hizballah. It was only a couple of weeks later, several weeks later, when the Lebanese Canadian Bank was hit with a 311 action, that the word Hizballah actually came out. And that, too, was only at the end of a long U.S. government interagency debate as to whether or not to even mention that this had anything to do with Hizballah. In fact, Hizballah is engaged in so much criminal activity that the vast majority of law enforcement activity targeting Hizballah never mentions Hizballah. It's simply easier to do it that way. It's less political, etc. But as David highlighted, and as I underlined in my notes here, one of the things to point out is that in the Ayman Juma case, we're talking about laundering as much as $200 million a month from cocaine sales in Europe and the Middle East to operations located in Colombia, Lebanon, West Africa, and I stress, Panama. Nobody is paying attention to Panama. I strongly suggest they do. Money exchange houses, bulk cash smuggling, and other schemes. So why is Hizballah crime on the rise? I think that there are several reasons. One is opportunity. Mike has spoken many times about the fact that once people taste the lucrative profit that is available in the drug industry, $320 billion a year industry according to the UN, that's what the UN says, it has to be more. If you're a criminal guy, then you want a piece of that. A. B, the spectrum of support activity really opens up the doors. That some of these schemes are directed by actual Hizballah leadership. Again, in the Philadelphia case, one of the people who was indicted was Hassan Hadroj, who's a Hizballah politician, a senior politician back in Beirut, and his son-in-law. And others are just sympathizers, and Hizballah is happy to benefit from some cut of the criminal proceeds that their sympathizers engage in. But I think there's other things too. Around mid-2008, according to intelligence sources I've spoken to, Iran, flushed from oil, increased oil prices, which in July of 2008 were about $145 a barrel, ramped up its funding to Hizballah. It had already provided what I like to call, as a former government official, supplemental funding for Hizballah in the wake of the July 2006 war to help Hizballah build grassroots support through reconstruction. But around 2008, significantly started ramping up its funding and to help Hizballah's soaring costs to rebuild. And indeed, Hizballah was desperately in need of this money, not only to rebuild, but then also with the June 2009 elections. So according to some sources, Iran pledged as much as $600 million to Hizballah for its political campaign alone. And by 2009, Israeli sources estimate that between the summer of 2006 and 2009, Iran had provided Hizballah more than $1 billion with a B, $billion in aid. The influx in money enabled Hizballah to do lots of things: hire more people, start more programs, and inflate its activities in Lebanon in particular. And so then, when Iran suddenly became a much less reliable donor very quickly, this led to a crisis for Hizballah, which became accustomed to this larger budget. So by mid-January 2009, oil prices had fallen to $36 a barrel. They remained at about 60 until May, drastically reducing Iran's oil profits. Today, it's about a little over $100 a barrel. But two of the other things that happened remain today. The first is international sanctions really began to bite, and I'd argue that they're biting even more so now. And the third is Iran's own fantastic ability, like nobody else, to engage in economic mismanagement. At the time, it was its crippling subsidies program for basic commodities. And so what happened is that Iran had to slash its budget to Hizballah by as much as 40% in 2009. That's believed to have rebounded. But that has an effect on Hizballah. The Green Movement also, June 2009, has an effect on Hizballah. Discussions at the time about whether or not there'll be a grand bargain with Iran, though I think it's highly unlikely, still has an effect on Hizballah. Hizballah does not want, in short, for there ever to be a day after. Whether it's a day after Iran decides to engage in a grand bargain and sell them out, or Iran suddenly doesn't have the funding anymore, or the Green Movement is successful, or the United States or Israel or protesting Syrians remove from power the people who are Hezbollah's greatest supporters. And because of that, they have diversified. And they have found for themselves an extremely lucrative business in criminal enterprise. And this has been balanced against their otherwise traditional interest in operational security. This is great news for us in the counterterrorism and counter-illicit finance communities, because on the one hand, these criminal activities have beefed up Hezbollah's coffers, and therefore they make it a more challenging adversary. On the other hand, it exposes Hezbollah to unprecedented risk. First of all, it's much, much easier, as I mentioned, to pursue and apprehend suspects as criminals than terrorists. The legal thresholds tend to be much more straightforward. There's none of the political tension of one man's terrorist being another man's freedom fighter. And frankly, for all those countries and regional bodies, think of the European Union, for example, that have not designated Hezbollah as a terrorist group and are therefore sometimes not as amenable to working with us against Hezbollah at a counterterrorism level, working with these countries and with these groups against people who may also be Hezbollah but are pushing drugs up through southern Spain is a no-brainer. And you get tremendous cooperation. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I really don't care if the Wall Street Journal or Financial Times reports Hezbollah cell busted or drug cell busted. If it's the same individual, score one for the good guys. We've seen many times that efforts to work with countries on counterterrorism is sometimes deemed political, but in other areas, illicit finance, they're more willing to work with us. It's not just Europe. Take, for example, South America, which is obviously a tremendous area of concern in terms of the tri-border area of Venezuela, etc., from the counterterrorism Hezbollah side, and much more broadly in terms of the counter-narcotics side. And I couldn't agree more with Mike's point about the need to fuse the two, the counter-narcotics and the counterterrorism foci on this region. In December 2006, when I was still at Treasury designated a tranche of Lebanese Hezbollah operatives in the region and exposed a tremendous amount of illicit activity, drugs, money laundering, all kinds of other stuff that was going on down there. And immediately after Treasury did so, Buenos Aires, Brasilia, and Asuncion all issued joint statements exculpating the suspects and rejecting the U.S. claims it's not possible because we don't have terrorism within our borders. That's not what they wanted out there publicly. And yet, just the very following year, the State Department reported in its annual illicit finance counter-drug report that the governments in the area, in the tri-border area, have long been concerned about drug smuggling, arms smuggling, and work with us very closely on those issues. And in fact, when we'd work with them on these issues, describing them as narcotics investigations or money laundering investigations, we got a lot more cooperation. I do think that there is a model for this, by the way, and I was amazed that as someone who's followed Hizballah for a long time, I wasn't aware of it, and so I'm not surprised if many of you aren't aware of it. But after the 1994 bombing of the Amia Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, there was, the U.S. involvement and others, an effort in the region, among the countries in the region, to quietly, not a counterterrorism initiative as much as a law enforcement initiative, but to target the illicit activities of individuals who happen to also be Hezbollah, whether it's in the free trade zones, not only the tri-border area, but Iquique, Chile, and other places, or elsewhere. And there was, quietly, some very, very good success in disrupting their activities in the region. Unfortunately, it was short-lived. Hezbollah and others in the region have now significantly rebuilt their capabilities, and I think that that has an immediate repercussion for us here in the Western Hemisphere. I don't want to go into any detail about the testimony, mine or Mike's testimony tomorrow for the House Homeland Security Committee, where they're holding a hearing on possible threats to the homeland from Hezbollah or Iran. But I will say that I think that this criminal activity plays into it. And tomorrow I'll be laying out 4 different threat scenarios of ways in which Hezbollah or Hezbollah networks could pose a threat to the United States here in the homeland if they desired to do so, even though Hizballah has never to date carried out any attacks in the homeland. And one of them is through criminal networks. And we have seen, and with this I will end, Hizballah increasingly, especially since 2001, but even beforehand, rely on some of the relationships it's built through criminal networks, even for operational purposes. Again, even before 2001, when Hizballah kidnapped Elchanan Tannenbaum in Europe in 2000, they used criminal elements to do a lot of the activities they needed to do in Europe to facilitate that kidnapping. But certainly since 2001, it's a very simple calculus that will surprise none of you. We collectively, in the West in particular, have done a lot to constrict the operating environment, whether it's Al-Qaeda or Hizballah or somebody else. All the different things that you need to do to facilitate terrorism, FBI and DHS, it's a world of difference today than it was when I first started at the FBI, years before 9/11, to their credit. That means that you need to think out the box if you want to be able to do something, especially if you want to do something in the West, Western Europe, or in the United States. And I do think, therefore, that these criminal activities, these criminal relationships could be leveraged for even things beyond financial and logistical support. And with that, I will end and open up to your questions.